Janora was a sweetheart. She was funny and witty, just like our dad. She was very athletic. She used to speed skate and played softball. She was good at everything she did.
Glenda McCrae and her sister Janora Stevens are more like best friends than siblings.
It was like, you know, you've heard of soul sisters? That's how we were. We'd talk on the phone plus have lunch every day. And she was a talker like I am. She told me everything, and I told her everything.
My mom was fantastic. She was my best friend growing up because I didn't have brothers or sisters. My mother and I did a lot together. She was the quintessential baseball mom, for sure.
Troy was a little ornery, fun. He loved sports, and he spent a lot of time at the ballpark. He was a good ball player.
She was at every practice, every game. My father coached the team, but my mother was the glue, and she was my biggest fan.
She was super involved. Troy was kind of her whole life, to be honest with you. He really was. On May 12th, 1987, Janora and I did not have lunch because she said she was going to have lunch with her husband, Phil, because her husband and my husband were going to go fishing that evening.
As their husbands will be at the lake, the sisters make plans of their own that day.
Me and Carrie went to Janora's house because we were all going to go shopping for a prom dress for my daughter, Carrie. Later that week, there was a prom at the private school that Troy and my daughter, Carrie, attended.
When me and my mother arrived, Troy and Janora were arguing.
Troy had gone to have his hair cut that day. He was due to have his pictures taken for school before the prom, and she wanted his hair to be longer. And because of that, Janora was furious.
They were loud, you know, yelling at each other, going back and forth. And so me and my mother stepped into the bathroom and shut the door. And we were kind of overwhelmed by that. I don't think it was very unusual for them to argue like that, but at the intensity that they were arguing, it was pretty high.
She and I had words. It was a little more out of hand than it should be.
The blow-up continues until Troy has to leave to go to a defensive driving class.
I had gotten my first car, and I got into a little fender bender, and I had to do that to keep my insurance clear. The last words that I heard from my mother were, "I love you." And we'll talk when we get home.
We spent all evening looking for a prom dress. And we got back to Janora's house, and she got out of the car and went to the back door. And she came through the house and went to the front door and opened the door and stepped out on the step and waved bye to me. And I thought, good, she's okay. So I went home. I would never have guessed that would be the last time I'd ever see her. And still to this day, I can't believe it, you know.
Glenda and Carrie head for home. Troy Stevens arrives back at his mother's house half an hour later.
I got home after school about 10 o'clock. When I walked into the house that night, from the doorway, I could see her laying in the floor. The closer I got, the more vivid it became. I saw my mother just brutally, just butchered. I don't know how else to put that. There are certain things we're just not meant to see. I remember physically going into shock. Strangest thing, but from the shins up, I remember that. I just remember that feeling in my body. I was pretty frantic, and I was screaming. I wasn't trying to piece together what had happened. I just knew that my mother was gone. I backed up into the kitchen to go use the phone and got an ambulance on the way.
Next, Troy calls his Aunt Glenda's house.
I was on the phone talking to my boyfriend, and on the other line, I got a beep in, and it was my cousin Troy. And he was yelling, he was screaming, I need to talk to Aunt Glenda.
And he said to me, Aunt Glenda, you better come quick. Mama's on the floor. I said, honey, she's probably fainted because we do that a lot in our family. I said, okay, honey, I'll be right there, because I could tell he was scared.
I sat next to my mother while I was waiting on the police. And then I remember the sirens, all the emergency personnel showing up.
We were the first car there, so we got out of our car, walked up and approached that front door, and we remained quiet so we could listen and see if we could hear a fight or a disturbance inside. I remember it was very quiet. We knocked, nobody answered. I pushed the door open, and it was then I could see from the porch all the way back to the den, Janora leaning against a wall in a somewhat seated position. She was wearing her night clothes. She appeared to have sustained multiple wounds. You could tell that there had been a tremendous struggle. It was an extremely vicious attack. It was probably one of the worst crime scenes I had ever seen. Someone had attacked her with such aggression that she was almost decapitated.
Carrie and I started driving to Janora's house, and as we turned the corner, about halfway down the street, I saw lights. I could see the yellow tape and a truck in the driveway.
My cousin Troy was sitting on the curb, and he had a bat, a baseball bat, aluminum bat, laying like next to him.
His hands were on his head, and he was going like this. And he was shaking. And the first thought that came to my mind was, oh my God, did they get in another fight? And I went over and hugged him because I just thought, oh my God, you know, what in the world happened?
My mother was dead on the floor in a pool of blood. I didn't know how to rationalize what was happening. I didn't understand it.
I think that when the young man saw what he saw, I think it just overwhelmed his senses. And he just seemed like he was very confused and disoriented to me.
After talking to Troy, Patrol Officer Clark secures the scene and waits for homicide detectives to arrive.
On that night in May, it was a normal night, although it was a little humid, which actually played a factor into this investigation later on. I didn't know what I was walking into. Genora was lying on the floor of the kitchen wearing a maroon house robe. There was a large amount of blood. The TV was on in the adjoining family room. There was a kitchen and a bar, and it looked like the incident happened there. There were some broken pieces of a large knife, which indicates that knife hit something hard and it broke. So that struck me as really brutal, a lot of force. This knife looked like it came from a kitchen drawer, so maybe this wasn't a premeditated murder. On the hallway wall to the left, there was a couple large blood smears, which indicated to me that the victim came in contact with that wall, probably trying to get out the door.
She almost got out. Do you know how many times I've thought about, well, what if she had? She's that far away. Breaks my heart.
Detective Huff searches the home looking for a motive or any clues as to what happened.
The residence didn't appear to be ransacked. It wasn't missing articles of expensive, nice televisions, a stereo. There was even $1,000 cash. So I didn't think that a burglary or robbery had occurred. The crime scene left a lot of questions. There was a fingerprint technician that went through the house. I don't recall that he got any prints that were valuable enough to be compared. But there were numerous strands of hair, which appeared to be the victim's.
Next, Huff focuses on investigating those closest to Genora, starting with her son, Troy.
There were circumstances where it made you think that Troy could be a suspect. There was no signs of forced entry. He had an argument with his mother that night, and he left, and it wasn't on the best of terms.
The police were, in the very beginning, checking out Troy, if he was on drugs, if he was an alcoholic, and all that kind of stuff. Understandably so, because we even questioned it as the family for a while.
Glenda can't help thinking about that phone call from Troy on the night of her sister's murder.
He never said one word about, oh my God, there's blood everywhere. I mean, that's the first thing that would have come out of my mouth. And I always wondered why. I thought maybe he knows more than he's telling me.
I spoke with Troy for quite a while. Troy was upset.
I'd just been asked if I'd killed my mother. What in the hell are you talking about? Did I kill my mother? I believe anyone would immediately take offense to that, especially an irrational kid that just found his mother murdered like a farm animal.
That's just part of the job. You have to sometimes be the bad guy. You have to sometimes kind of test those limits to see what the response is. But we saw Troy very soon after the discovery, and his reactions were consistent with somebody just discovering a tragedy. So I didn't come away thinking he was a viable suspect. About, I'm wanting to say 1 or 2 in the morning, Phil, the husband, arrived home. I spoke to him and found out that he had come home from a fishing trip. Phil's demeanor was demanding answers, what happened to my wife. But I don't recall Phil being very candid about their relationship.
If you just met Phil on the street, he was a nice enough guy. He was a nice looking guy. He had been a Marine, so I always respected him for that. I acted like I liked him because of Janora, but I didn't like him, never liked him. He was a shyster.
Phil was my uncle and a real strict father to Troy. Very controlling, very intimidating. When I went over to their house, I would always ask my cousin, "Will you go get me a drink?" Because I really was kind of scared of him.
Janora was very good at covering things up and being loyal to her husband, but you could tell because she'd have bruises and, uh, you know, I encouraged her, to be honest with you, to leave him. Uh, like most battered wives, they don't do it.
Janora's sister Glenda has good reason for suspecting Phil.
The night that we went shopping, she said to me, "Glenda, if anything ever happens to me, will you promise me that you will never let Troy live with Phil's mother?" And I said, "Of course. You don't have to worry about him if anything ever happened to you, but it's not going to." When you look back at it, you're like, oh my God, she said that to me. You know? Was there something to be afraid of? It haunts me.
The autopsy showed that Janora was stabbed almost 30 times. It was all over her body. Her neck was cut open in a huge gash.
And what it tells me is that there's a lot of anger, a lot of rage, a lot of very personal.
There were traces of semen that were found on her body that show she was sexually assaulted sometime during this intrusion.
This was before DNA. It's not going to lead you to an exact person.
And she had severe gashes in her fingers and her hands where you could tell that she had tried to deflect the knife.
She was feisty and she was a fighter. And I can't help but think that she was scared to death. And just that in itself, it was the most horrible thought, that she was that scared. And I know she was.
With no new leads from the forensics, suspicion shifts back to Janora's husband.
I did think Phil was capable of murdering my sister. Yes, I did. I suspected Phil because he acted so remorseful. About a week or so after her funeral, Phil said that he wanted to go and get her clothes and pack them. And so I went with him because, you know, I felt sorry for him. And Phil sat in the floor and opened the drawer of the dresser and took her lingerie out and smelled it. It was weird. And then he literally just got rid of everything that reminded him of her in a week. Didn't even ask any of us if we wanted anything of hers. Phil ended up marrying a girl that he went to high school with 3.5 months or so after Janora was buried. And Janora and I both knew he was seeing her before. And so that was even harder. It just made me hate him that much more.
We did take a set of fingerprints to see if they matched anything in the blood, because it's his house. His fingerprints will be there, but if there was a print in the blood, that would be a big deal, and there weren't. There was no evidence, no leads. Phil had an alibi that he was fishing. That alibi checked out. We just got past him as a suspect. Having a bad marriage doesn't automatically make you a killer.
Almost convinced that Phil has nothing to do with Janora's murder, Huff falls back on old-fashioned police work, looking for fresh leads.
I spent a lot of time just sitting in the neighborhood, just watching what was going on, just getting the idea of what this neighborhood was like.
3 months after the murder, Huff's patience pays off.
In early August, I saw a couple girls sitting in a car down the block, smoking marijuana. And I asked them, "Do you remember when that lady got murdered?" And they said, "Oh yeah, that night, we were sitting down here and this guy came walking up to our car, asked us to give him a ride somewhere." And they said, for some reason, he had on a light blue jean jacket and it was buttoned all the way up. And that was very odd because it was so warm and humid. They saw some scratches and marks on his neck that made them think he'd been into a fight. And this really interested me. Hey, we're on to something. We've got a path here, so let's go with it. They told me the guy's name was Quentin Barnes.
Quentin Barnes was a teenager. He had some background in some minor crimes, either drugs or property crimes, but no crimes of violence that we knew at that time. He was living on and off next door to Janora Stevens. His sister, Victoria Barnes, lived in the house next door, and he would stay sometime with her and her boyfriend.
Huff checks the sister's address. Quentin Barnes is not there.
I did speak to Victoria Barnes about her brother, and she was not uncooperative, but she had no information that was helpful that she would share with me.
She defended her brother and said that there's no way that he could have been involved in such a horrific or brutal crime.
Ultimately, I figured out where Quentin was staying, and I put together an affidavit for a search warrant to search for any evidence, specifically for a jean jacket. I found an unkept apartment, and I went into a closet, and there was a light blue jean jacket laying on the floor. I was so excited. Now here I am on the right track. When the jacket was analyzed, they found a hair that was brown. It was dyed, as was Janora's hair. It was the same color. So I'm thinking, wow, this is good. I potentially have big evidence. The evidence that we had is a jean jacket like the one Quentin Barnes was observed wearing that night. And on that jean jacket, there was a hair that was consistent with the victim's.
Detectives send the hair for testing to try and prove for certain that it matches Janora Stevens.
But the analysis of the hair came back that it was not Janora's hair. It wasn't Quentin Barnes either.
I wasn't happy with the process. I just felt that I didn't have people that really were up to date on the science.
Despite the test results, Detective Huff's gut tells him Quentin Barnes is somehow involved in Janora Stevens' murder.
So I go talk to Quentin, and he denied, saying he was never in the house, didn't have anything to do with it. Just the look in his face and his tone of voice. I'm thinking this guy's a ticking time bomb. And I was really getting upset with myself and not getting everything that we needed. You know, you get frustrated, but you try not to let it bother you. And then I got promoted, and you have to go back to a uniform division for at least a year to learn how to be a supervisor. So I was away from investigations, and at the same time, I'm going through a really ugly divorce, okay? That kind of threw me for a loop. You know, it really stalled things a bit. These cases do affect your home life. I was always on call. I had a couple sleeping bags at my office, and so a lot of times my kids had to go to sleep at the police station. There is a balance that I didn't find.
With Huff off the homicide beat, the case of the murdered mother goes as cold as an Oklahoma ice storm.
It got cold. It got really cold. And for a while we were thinking, no, they're never going to solve it. You drive yourself crazy thinking up all these things that could have happened. And you get so frustrated. Everyone has their own ideas of what happened, of who was involved, and who the killer is. It never leaves your mind.
After Mike Huff completes his supervisor training, he's promoted to head up Tulsa PD's homicide unit and picks up where he left off on Janora's murder.
When I first got back, I kind of assessed where we were, you know, where the hair evidence was, what its status was.
Huff had never been happy with the first analysis of the hair found on Quentin Barnes' jacket, so he requests a closer forensic examination.
The jean jacket was sent for forensic analysis. At that point in time, the Tulsa Police Department lab had hired a forensic analyst who had previously worked for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and it completely overruled the first hair analysis. Yes, there is a match on the hair. Janora's hair was on the jacket.
And there's more damning evidence on Quentin Barnes' jacket.
Fibers were found that matched the robe that Janora Stevens was wearing when she died. And blue fibers were found under her fingernails that matched the type of fibers that were in the jean jacket that was in Quentin Barnes' closet. And it would be consistent with clawing at her attacker.
I mean, this is telling a story. It was coming together. All I needed was a final piece of evidence.
There were now 3 different ways that tied Quentin Barnes to the scene that night forensically: the hair, the robe fibers, and the jean jacket under her fingernails. That forensic evidence was huge.
This case is coming together piece by piece.
Detective Huff re-interviews Quentin's sister, Victoria, who lived next door to the crime scene. So much time has passed that she's more willing to talk, and what she says blows open the case.
Now, she was more open to telling me some more facts. She said that Quentin made comments to her admitting guilt, that he killed her and will never find the knife.
It was a huge break in the case.
So I convinced the DA to file the charges, to issue an arrest warrant, and I told him our best bet is to me to talk to Quentin when he's in custody.
The determination was made that we're going to charge this case. We believe we have a strong enough case to convict him with what we have now, and we think the time to go forward is right now. Quentin Barnes, at this point in time, years after 1987, was now married, had a good job, was, if you would, an outstanding member of the community.
I found him at his home. He opened the door. I said, Quentin, we need to go. He goes, Mike, you know, I didn't kill that woman. I said, Quentin, you're under arrest for murder.
Never had heard of him, ever. I never even heard that name, period. Quentin. We were elated just that someone had been arrested. Just happy that it was going to be solved.
Mike brought Quentin Barnes down to the police station and had a video set up to video record the statement that Quentin Barnes was going to give. At the time, that was unique.
You have the right to remain silent. You do not have to answer any questions or make any statement. Do you understand that right? Yes. I know it's tough, Quentin, but it's important that you get this straight. Remember in as detail as you can. What? I need to hear what happened, Quentin.
Yeah. He was initially a bit confused. You know, why now? Why didn't we do this 6 years ago or whatever? But he was nervous.
I was living with my sister. Just kind of hitting this and doing drugs. What kind of drugs were you doing? Cocaine. Were you stealing to support your habit? Occasionally.
Barnes admits to breaking into Genora's house on that night, back in May 1987.
I got him to draw the interior of the house on a chalkboard.
We came back, we waited out here, went back in. Here's a living room here. Something like that.
And it was good. I mean, if I hadn't been in that house, I wouldn't have known that it was so accurate.
So Quentin Barnes admitted to being there, but being there with his sister.
I don't know what she was going to get. She just said that we was going to try to get some drug money.
And you said Victoria wanted you to go with her so you could watch.
Just to watch and see if somebody came home or not. I wasn't in there that long.
You said you were in there for 3 minutes.
I seen my sister pick up the knife after they started wrestling around.
He pointed the finger at his sister entirely.
I did not kill her. My sister did.
You're saying that you saw your sister Victoria stabbed Janora Stevens, and you didn't do anything to go help the lady. And out of all the times that I've talked to you the past 7 years, you've not once told me this story.
It was just grasping at straws to try to blame the sister. It just didn't work.
She always told me that she would try to tell him that tell everybody that I did it, that I was there, that I stabbed her. I did not stab her. She stabbed her.
But Victoria Barnes had an alibi because she and her husband were at a bar the hours during the murder.
I saw Victoria drive down the street and come home probably about 11:30 or 12 o'clock midnight that night, and we were able to go back to the bar. They knew her. They knew her husband. They said, oh, yeah, she's here all evening. So she's out of it. Plus the fact that there's sperm in Janora's throat. There's no way you can shift that blame to Victoria.
Did you have sex with that woman?
No, I did
I
not.
want you to look me in the eye, and I want you to tell me, did you sexually touch that woman that night?
No, I did not, Mike.
We're walking down the hall to get booked into jail. I said, Quentin, if you didn't have sex with her, how did sperm get in her throat? And he says, my sister's bisexual. And I said, you're crazy. Holy cow, that was really stupid. You know, he just dug himself a deeper hole.
Barnes never quite confesses to the murder on videotape, but his story is so implausible, prosecutors are confident of a conviction.
The trial was tense because it was a death penalty case. So there's a tremendous amount of emotion. It's just the stakes are the ultimate.
After 7.5 years, the thing that was the most shocking to me was walking in and him looking at me, staring at me. And I just stared a hole through him the whole time. I just stared a hole through him.
The picture I painted for the jury is that Quentin Barnes went to that house to do a burglary, but there was a confrontation where he was discovered in the house and ended up stabbing her 30 times. That video is extremely powerful. As a jury, they want to see the reaction, the body language, how their eyes are darting in and out. Did they hesitate? But it wasn't the end of the case because it was he said, she said. How will the jury take a he said, she said finger pointing between a brother and sister that were now, if you would, estranged? We had to build those pieces to exclude Victoria and then use that forensic evidence that we had that clearly focused on Quentin Barnes as being the killer. I put a tremendous amount of stock in the blue fibers that were found from his jean jacket. And the fingernail fibers show he was the one being clawed at. It wasn't that he was just in a back room while his sister was doing all this work.
When Victoria told her story, then that nailed him.
Quentin Barnes was found guilty of first-degree murder.
The day they read the verdict, it was a whole new set of emotions because it had been as long as it had been.
I felt so satisfied. You know, it's a big portion of my life. It was like 7 years, and that was a hard 7 years.
We were all just crying to ourselves and hugging each other and everything, and it just felt wonderful. We were like, finally, you know, this has come to an end.
The jury came back with a recommendation of life without parole. There was a strong sentiment in the room that death was an appropriate punishment in this case, but you need 12, and there was somebody in the room that was not willing to make that step.
In the end, Quentin Barnes takes that final step by himself.
couple days after trial, Quentin Barnes took his own life by overdosing on pills in the Tulsa County Jail. Ultimately, we were asking for the death penalty, and we got it.
Quentin Barnes, he got what he deserved.
Divine intervention. That's exactly how I felt. That was his admission right there.
My mother's murder, it has formed a lot of my life. It's made me a very cautious person. I've tried over the years to keep this in perspective. It became about life now and not about life without a mom.
I loved her so much. I can't even tell you how much and how special she was to me. When she was murdered, it was just like I lost my right arm. She was just my baby sister.
I don't like to think of that night. I don't like to think of her that way. My mom was something else. I miss her. I miss what I remember of her.
There is a profound and deeply unsettling comfort in the predictability of a suburban morning. The rising sun casts long, familiar shadows across manicured lawns. The rhythmic hum of daily life begins with the brewing of coffee, the starting of car engines, and the soft, chaotic symphony of a household waking up to face another ordinary day. In the collective consciousness of society, the family home is revered as the ultimate sanctuary. It is the fortress where the most vulnerable among us are supposed to be shielded from the unpredictable dangers of the outside world. We are conditioned to look outward for monsters. We are taught to fear the stranger in the dark, the intruder at the door, the unseen predator lurking in the shadows of society. Rarely, if ever, are we prepared to confront the terrifying reality that sometimes the most profound darkness does not breach the home from the outside. Sometimes, the darkness is already inside, deeply rooted in the very core of the family structure, slowly consuming the mind of the one person who is biologically and socially entrusted with the role of the ultimate protector. This is a story about the absolute collapse of that sanctuary. It is a story that forces us to look away from the comforting illusions of safety and stare directly into the abyss of the human mind when it is fractured beyond recognition. The events that unfolded in Houston, Texas, on the morning of June 20th, 2001, did not just destroy a single family. They shattered the foundational beliefs of a nation regarding motherhood, sanity, and the delicate, often invisible line between a tragic medical failing and a calculated act of unimaginable horror. What happened in that house remains one of the most polarizing, devastating, and complex tragedies in the annals of American criminal history. It is a case that sits at the volatile intersection of medicine, law, religious extremism, and the catastrophic consequences of a mind completely hijacked by disease. To understand the gravity of this tragedy, one must first understand the devastatingly narrow window of time in which it occurred. Time is a relative concept, but on that specific Wednesday morning, time became the single most crucial element in a terrifying equation. For a household bustling with 5 young children, routine was the only mechanism keeping chaos at bay. The father of the family, Rusty Yates, had established a morning protocol designed to manage the overwhelming demands of his household. Aware of the delicate state of his home, Rusty relied heavily on the support system they had put in place. His daily departure for work was carefully synchronized with the arrival of his mother, who would come over to help manage the children and the house. This routine was meant to be a safety net, an unbroken chain of supervision and care. However, on the morning of June 20th, there was a fatal flaw in the schedule. There was a gap. A seemingly insignificant window of approximately 1 single hour existed between the exact moment Rusty drove away from the house to begin his workday and the anticipated moment his mother would walk through the front door to take over the daily responsibilities. 60 minutes. In the grand scope of a lifetime, an hour is nothing. It is a commute, a television episode, a fleeting pause in the rush of existence. But in the context of severe, untreated mental illness, an hour is an eternity. It is an expansive, unmonitored void where reality can completely disintegrate. It was within this solitary, quiet hour that Andrea Yates, left completely alone with her 5 young children, stepped out of the reality the rest of the world inhabited and surrendered entirely to the suffocating grip of a meticulously constructed, hallucination-driven nightmare. The woman who remained in that house as the clock ticked through that solitary hour was not functioning as a mother in any traditional sense of the word. Andrea Yates was a woman drowning in the deepest, most suffocating depths of severe mental illness. Her psychological profile was not a sudden mystery. It was a well-documented, highly complex history of profound suffering. She had endured a long, agonizing battle with extreme psychiatric conditions. She had previously attempted to end her own life multiple times, a desperate cry from a mind that could no longer bear the weight of its own existence. She had been hospitalized in psychiatric facilities, observed by professionals, and formally diagnosed with severe postpartum depression complicated by the terrifying presence of postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia. The medical community had recognized the immense danger she was in. Physicians who had studied her fragile mental state had issued stark, unambiguous warnings to the family. They had explicitly advised against having more children, understanding that the overwhelming physical and hormonal toll of pregnancy and childbirth carried an extraordinarily high risk of triggering a catastrophic relapse of her psychotic symptoms. Yet, these urgent medical warnings collided violently with deeply ingrained, extreme religious beliefs. The family's faith dictated a path that fundamentally contradicted the desperate pleas of psychiatric professionals. Furthermore, the delicate balance of her mental stability was shattered by the untimely cessation and alteration of her necessary psychiatric medications. The withdrawal of this chemical support system removed the final barrier holding back the floodgates of her illness. By the time that 1-hour window opened on the morning of June the 20th, Andrea's psychological state had completely collapsed. The woman in that house was no longer tethered to logic, to reason, or to the loving reality of her family. She was entirely consumed by a severe psychotic break. In the twisted, distorted reality created by her schizophrenia and psychosis, Andrea did not see herself as a murderer. This is perhaps the most chilling and difficult aspect of the case for the human mind to process. The public naturally seeks malice in violence. We look for hatred, greed, or a fundamental evil to explain the inexplicable. But the horror of Andrea Yates's motivation was rooted in a deeply deformed manifestation of maternal love and religious terror. In the throes of her hallucinations, she had become absolutely convinced that she was a fundamentally evil, irredeemable mother. She believed with absolute, unwavering certainty that she was possessed by demonic forces, that Satan himself had infiltrated her soul and, by extension, the souls of her children. Her psychosis constructed a terrifying, inescapable logic. She believed that because of her own perceived corruption, her children were doomed to grow up, become evil, and ultimately burn in the eternal fires of hell. In her profoundly sick mind, the world was a spiritual battlefield, and she had already lost. The delusions whispered a horrifying solution to her, presenting it not as an act of violence, but as an act of ultimate, desperate salvation. She genuinely believed that the only possible way to rescue the eternal souls of her children, to ensure they remained pure and innocent enough to enter the kingdom of heaven, was to end their earthly lives before the darkness could consume them. She was, in her fractured reality, saving them from a fate worse than death. It was a dark, twisted mission of mercy born entirely from the depths of profound psychiatric illness. The physical execution of this delusion was as methodical as it was devastating. As the hour ticked by, the suburban quiet of the house was replaced by the sound of rushing water. She went into the bathroom and filled the bathtub to the brim. The sheer normality of the object, a simple household fixture designed for comfort and cleanliness, was violently transformed into an instrument of unimaginable tragedy. She then proceeded, one by one, to bring her children into that bathroom. The names and ages of those children must be spoken to truly comprehend the magnitude of what was lost in that hour. Luke, just 2 years old. Paul, only 3. John, 5 years old. And the youngest, baby Mary, a fragile infant of only 6 months. One after another, the children who relied on their mother for their very survival were subdued by her hands in the water. After each life was extinguished, Andrea performed a ritual that underscored the deep, agonizing conflict between the mother she was supposed to be and the illness that had consumed her. She did not hide them in a panic. She did not flee the scene in a desperate attempt to escape consequence. Instead, she gently lifted their lifeless bodies from the water, carried them into a bedroom, laid them upon the bed, and carefully covered them with a blanket, as if she were simply tucking them in for a long, peaceful sleep. The tragedy reached its absolute peak of horror when her oldest child, 7-year-old Noah, entered the bathroom. Noah, who was old enough to understand fear, walked in and saw the lifeless body of his infant sister Mary still floating in the water. Instinct took over, and the young boy turned and desperately tried to run. He tried to escape the nightmare that had suddenly consumed his home, but his mother pursued him. She chased down her own terrified son, overpowered his desperate struggles, and forced him into the same water, ending his life right next to the small body of his baby sister. In a matter of minutes, a family of 5 vibrant, beautiful children was entirely wiped out, leaving behind a silence so heavy it continues to echo through the decades. When the horrific task dictated by her delusions was complete, the hour was nearing its end. The darkness that had driven her actions began to settle into a chilling, emotionless calm. Andrea Yates did not attempt to clean the scene. She did not attempt to formulate a lie. She simply walked to the telephone. Her first call was to emergency services. When the 911 dispatcher answered, they did not hear the frantic, hysterical screams of a woman in distress. They heard a flat, detached voice. She simply told them they needed to send police officers to her home. She said she needed them. Immediately after hanging up with emergency services, she dialed the number for her husband, Rusty, who was just settling into his workday, completely unaware that his entire world had already ended. Her message to him was equally brief, entirely devoid of emotion, and chillingly direct. She simply told him that it was time to come home, and that he needed to come home right now. When the first police officers arrived at the suburban residence, they were met at the door by Andrea. Her clothes were soaking wet. Her demeanor was disturbingly placid. She offered no resistance, no tears, and no excuses. She calmly confessed to exactly what she had done, leading the officers into the house to witness the unimaginable scene she had left on the bed. In that moment, as the wet clothes clung to her skin, and the officers stood paralyzed by the sight of the 5 children tucked beneath the blankets, a massive legal and medical storm was born. The immediate aftermath of the morning of June the 20th, 2001, would ignite one of the most intense, fiercely debated, and emotionally exhausting legal battles in the history of the American justice system. The case of Andrea Yates would force a society that desperately wanted simple answers, a society that wanted to categorize her simply as an evil monster, to confront the incredibly complex, nuanced, and terrifying realities of postpartum depression and severe mental illness. It would put the very concept of the insanity defense on trial, forcing juries, judges, and the watching world to ask impossible questions about culpability, awareness, and the exact point where a broken mind can no longer be held legally responsible for its actions. The story of that one solitary hour in Houston would push the boundaries of medical science and criminal law to their absolute breaking points, leaving a legacy that still haunts the halls of justice and psychiatric wards to this very day. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that befell the Yates household, one must first look beyond the horrific finality of that June morning and examine the foundation upon which this family was built. We must look at the victims, not just as names etched into a police report, but as vibrant, breathing children who were the absolute center of a world that ultimately betrayed them. We must also examine the incredibly complex and tragic portrait of a woman who was slowly, inexorably swallowed whole by a disease that fractured her reality and transformed her from a caretaker into a captor. The narrative of the Yates family is not a simple story of sudden, unprovoked violence. It is a slow-moving, agonizing chronicle of a mental health catastrophe that unfolded in plain sight, a disaster that was predicted by medical professionals but ultimately ignored due to a catastrophic collision of severe illness, rigid ideology, and systemic failure. Before the darkness became absolute, the Yates family presented a picture that, to the outside observer, might have seemed like the quintessential, chaotic, yet loving American household. There were 5 young lives that filled the walls of their Houston home with the unrelenting energy that only a large family possesses. Noah was the eldest, a 7-year-old boy who was beginning to understand the world around him, taking on the role of the big brother. Then came John, 5 years old, followed closely by 3-year-old Paul and 2-year-old Luke. Finally, there was baby Mary, a fragile infant of only 6 months. These 5 children represented a constant, overwhelming tide of needs, laughter, tears, and physical demands. They were completely and utterly dependent on the adults in their lives for their safety, their nourishment, and their understanding of love. They were entirely innocent, blissfully unaware of the psychological storm that was gathering strength inside the mind of the woman who had given them life. The mother of these 5 children, Andrea Yates, was a woman whose identity had become entirely consumed by a profoundly complex and incredibly dangerous psychiatric condition. Her descent into the abyss was not instantaneous. It was a prolonged, agonizing journey marked by steep declines and terrifying episodes that signaled a mind in severe distress. Andrea's medical history was not a secret hidden from her family or her doctors. It was a well-documented trail of psychological devastation. She had suffered through intense periods of unbearable darkness, leading her to attempt to take her own life on multiple occasions. These suicide attempts were not mere cries for attention, but the desperate, terrifying actions of a woman who felt entirely crushed beneath the weight of her own brain chemistry. Her suffering was so profound and her actions so alarming that they necessitated multiple admissions into psychiatric hospitals, where she was placed under the close observation of mental health professionals who tried desperately to pull her back from the edge. Within the sterile walls of these medical facilities, a terrifying clinical picture began to emerge. The doctors who evaluated Andrea did not just see a woman struggling with the ordinary stress of motherhood. They diagnosed her with severe postpartum depression, a condition that is debilitating in its own right, but in Andrea's case, it was monstrously complicated by the emergence of postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia. This combination of diagnoses represents one of the most volatile and dangerous psychiatric states imaginable. Postpartum psychosis is a rare but incredibly severe illness that can cause a complete detachment from reality. It introduces hallucinations, profound illusions, and cognitive disorganization that completely strip away a person's ability to reason or perceive the world accurately. When combined with the underlying framework of schizophrenia, Andrea's mind became a fertile ground for the most terrifying distortions of reality. She was not just sad or overwhelmed. She was actively battling a brain disease that was feeding her a constant stream of horrifying, inescapable falsehoods. The medical professionals who treated Andrea recognized the immense peril she was in. They understood the fragile nature of her mental stability and the incredibly specific triggers that caused her to spiral into psychosis. Armed with this knowledge, her doctors issued a stark, unambiguous, and critical warning to both Andrea and her husband. They explicitly advised the couple that Andrea should absolutely not have any more children. The medical consensus was clear and terrifying. The physical, emotional, and profound hormonal shifts associated with pregnancy and childbirth were essentially a guaranteed catalyst for a catastrophic relapse of her severe psychotic symptoms. To introduce another pregnancy into her incredibly unstable physiological and psychological ecosystem was akin to pouring gasoline onto a smoldering fire. The doctors knew that her mind simply could not withstand the biological trauma of another birth without shattering completely. However, This urgent, life-saving medical advice was met with a formidable and ultimately fatal obstacle: the family's deeply ingrained, extreme religious beliefs. The Yates family adhered to an incredibly rigid ideological framework that fundamentally clashed with the realities of modern psychiatric medicine. Their faith dictated a worldview where the size of their family was a direct reflection of divine will, and any attempt to artificially limit the number of children they brought into the world was viewed as an affront to their spiritual convictions. This extreme religious doctrine created an impossible, suffocating conflict for Andrea. On one side stood the empirical, scientific reality of her severe mental illness and the desperate warnings of her physicians. On the other side stood the overwhelming pressure of a religious ideology that demanded she continue to bear children, framing motherhood and continuous procreation as her absolute spiritual duty. Tragically, in the battle between medical science and extreme religious dogma prevailed. The warnings of the psychiatrists were ultimately disregarded, pushed aside by a belief system that demanded continuous sacrifice, even at the cost of the mother's sanity. The decision to continue expanding their family despite the known, catastrophic risks sealed the fate of everyone in that household. With the birth of each subsequent child, the burden on Andrea's fractured mind grew exponentially heavier. The birth of her youngest child, Mary, was the final, devastating blow to a psychological structure that was already deeply compromised. The very event that their faith celebrated as a blessing was the biological trigger that plunged Andrea into the deepest, most inescapable episode of psychosis she had ever experienced. The tragedy was further compounded and arguably accelerated to its horrific conclusion by the mismanagement of her vital psychiatric medication. The chemical support system that was the only fragile barrier holding back the floodgates of her schizophrenia and psychosis was compromised. Whether through a misguided belief that she could overcome her illness through sheer willpower and faith, or through a tragic misunderstanding of how these complex medications functioned, Andrea's medication regimen was inappropriately altered and stopped. The withdrawal of these essential antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs removed the last remaining tethers connecting her to reality. Without the medication to suppress the hallucinations and regulate her brain chemistry, her mind was left completely defenseless against the onslaught of her illness. The delusions grew louder, more persistent, and infinitely more terrifying. As the days marched toward that fateful June morning, Andrea Yates was no longer living in the same reality as the rest of her family. She was physically present in the suburban house, but psychologically, she was trapped in a horrifying alternate dimension constructed entirely by her untreated schizophrenia. The extreme religious beliefs that had encouraged her to have more children now mutated within her sick mind, providing the dark, twisted vocabulary for her delusions. She did not just feel like a bad mother. Her psychosis convinced her that she was an instrument of evil, deeply corrupted and completely irredeemable. The true victims of this cascading series of failures were the 5 children who lived their short lives entirely at the mercy of their mother's degrading mental state. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary were completely defenseless. They did not understand the concept of mental illness. They did not know about the doctor's warnings, the religious pressures, or the medication that had been taken away. All they knew was the woman who fed them, bathed them, and tucked them into bed. They looked at her and saw their mother, their protector, the center of their universe. They had absolutely no way of knowing that the face looking back at them was masking a mind that was actively plotting their destruction under the tragic, delusional belief that it was an act of ultimate salvation. The presence of the children in that house, their sheer vulnerability, is what elevates this case from a medical tragedy to a horror of unfathomable proportions. Every laugh, every cry, every demand for attention from those 5 children likely echoed in Andrea's diseased mind, reinforcing the terrifying delusion that she was failing them, that she was dooming them to a spiritual eternity of torment. The very existence of the children, the physical proof of her motherhood, became the trigger for her darkest psychotic impulses. They were caught in an impossible, invisible web. The home that should have been their sanctuary was instead the very place where their doom was being meticulously reasoned out by a mind that had lost all connection to human logic. The intersection of severe, untreated mental illness and extreme ideological pressure created an environment where survival became impossible for the most vulnerable members of the family. The children were completely isolated within the walls of their home, alone with a mother whose reality had been entirely rewritten by schizophrenia and postpartum psychosis. The safety net that should have protected them, the medical interventions, the familial support, the societal safeguards, had all completely disintegrated. They were left entirely exposed to the devastating consequences of a disease that had taken full control of their mother's actions. As the sun rose on June the 20th, the stage was set for a tragedy that was years in the making. The severe illness, the ignored medical warnings, the extreme religious pressures, and the lack of medication had all coalesced into a perfect, deadly storm within Andrea Yates's mind. The 5 children woke up that morning expecting a day like any other, expecting the routine and the comfort of their home. They had no warning that the darkness that had been slowly consuming their mother was about to spill over into the physical world, and that the one person they trusted more than anyone else on earth was about to become the instrument of their ultimate demise. The portrait of this family, leading up to that fatal hour, is a chilling testament to the devastating power of mental illness when it is allowed to fester untreated and unmanaged, a slow-moving train wreck that ultimately destroyed the lives of 5 innocent children who never had a chance to escape. The morning of June the 20th, 2001, began with a deceptive veneer of ordinary routine in the Yates household, masking the profound psychological catastrophe that was about to unfold. The sun rose over the Houston suburbs, casting a bright, warm light across the manicured lawns and quiet streets, offering no outward sign of the horror that had been meticulously constructed within the walls of that single-family home. For the 5 children who woke up that morning, life was shaped by the simple, comforting boundaries of their daily existence, defined by breakfast, play, and the presence of their mother. They had no way of knowing that the woman who had cared for them, fed them, and held them was no longer inhabiting the same reality as they were. Her mind, ravaged by years of severe postpartum psychosis and untreated schizophrenia, had completely surrendered to a terrifying, inescapable delusion. The world outside the house continued to spin on its normal axis, unaware that inside this particular residence, a silent, irreversible tragedy was rapidly approaching its devastating climax. The mechanics of that morning were built upon a very specific, fragile schedule that the family relied on to manage the immense workload of raising 5 young children. Rusty Yates, the father, had structured his departures for work around a reliable support system designed to ensure that Andrea was never left entirely alone to shoulder the immense, crushing weight of caring for Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. Every single day, his exit from the house was tightly coordinated with the anticipated arrival of his mother, who would step in to provide immediate assistance, supervision, and relief. This routine was not merely a matter of convenience. It was a vital safety protocol, a carefully maintained bridge spanning the turbulent waters of Andrea's severe mental instability. However, on this particular Wednesday, a fatal disruption occurred within that routine, creating a dangerous, unmonitored vacuum that fate would exploit in the cruelest manner imaginable. A solitary, fateful window of approximately 1 hour opened between the exact moment Rusty started his car and drove away to begin his workday and the scheduled arrival of his mother at the front door. 60 minutes. To an outsider, an hour is a fleeting fragment of time, barely enough to complete a mundane chore or listen to a few songs on the radio. But within the distorted, hyper-accelerated timeline of a severe psychotic episode, 60 minutes was an expansive, infinite canvas upon which a nightmare could be fully realized. As soon as the front door closed behind her husband, leaving her alone with the children, Andrea Yates stepped entirely across the threshold separating the real world from her hallucinations. The quiet of the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the suffocating pressure of a perceived spiritual war, a battle where her twisted logic dictated that immediate, horrific action was the only possible path to salvation. Without the stabilizing presence of another adult to anchor her, the full, unbridled force of her schizophrenia took complete control of her physical actions. Her movements were not driven by panic, rage, or malice, but by a chilling, methodical sense of purpose born from her absolute belief that she was rescuing her children from eternal damnation. She walked into the bathroom and turned the handles, allowing the water to rush into the bathtub. The sound of the filling tub became the soundtrack to a systematic tragedy. The ordinary household fixture, meant for warmth and cleanliness, was transformed into an instrument of absolute finality. With a terrifying calm that defied human comprehension, she began the process of gathering her children, bringing them into the bathroom one by one, completely unaware of the horrifying betrayal they were experiencing at the hands of the person they trusted most in the world. The youngest children, unable to comprehend the nature of the danger, offered no resistance as they were led to the water. Little Luke, only 2 years old, was the first, followed by 3-year-old Paul and 5-year-old John. With a detached, robotic precision that reflected her absolute detachment from reality, Andrea submerged them one by one until their tiny struggles ceased. The finality of these actions did not cause her to hesitate or question her delusions. Instead, they fueled her terrifying resolve, driving her forward through the sequence she believed was ordained by a higher, desperate necessity. The youngest of all, 6-month-old baby Mary, was brought in last, her fragile infant body offering no defense against the overwhelming tragedy that had overtaken the household. Each life was extinguished in the quiet confines of that bathroom, replaced by a devastating, unnatural stillness that began to settle over the entire house. However, the sequence of events took a horrifyingly complex turn when the oldest child entered the space. 7-year-old Noah, old enough to perceive danger and recognize that something was deeply wrong, walked into the bathroom and was confronted with the unthinkable sight of his baby sister floating lifelessly in the water. In that single, critical moment, the primal instinct for survival overrode his confusion. Noah turned and ran, desperately trying to escape the horrifying reality unfolding before his eyes. He attempted to flee down the hallway, seeking safety in a home that had suddenly transformed into a trap. But his mother pursued him. The psychosis that commanded her actions did not allow for exceptions, even for the eldest son she loved dearly. She chased down her terrified 7-year-old boy, overpowered his desperate attempts to get away, and dragged him back to the very water where his siblings lay, ending his life right beside the small, motionless body of baby Mary. With the physical execution of her horrifying mission complete, Andrea did not attempt to flee, hide, or escape the consequences of what she had done. Instead, the profound, chilling calm of her psychosis dictated her next steps. She carefully lifted the lifeless bodies of her children from the water, carrying them out of the bathroom and into the master bedroom. With a haunting tenderness that underscored the agonizing fracture of her mind, she laid each child out upon the bed, arranging them neatly and covering them carefully with blankets, as if she were simply putting them to sleep for an afternoon nap. She tucked them in with meticulous care, the horrifying contradiction between her gentle physical gestures and the monstrous nature of her acts highlighting the absolute depth of her psychological detachment. The bedroom became a silent shrine to a tragedy born entirely from the darkest depths of an untreated, unmanaged brain disease. As the final moments of that fateful 1-hour window ticked away, Andrea stood in the quiet house, surrounded by the devastating consequences of her hallucinations. The frantic chaos of raising 5 children had been replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. The time had come for her to close the loop of the nightmare she had enacted. She walked calmly to the telephone, her hands steady, her mind completely sequestered within the walls of her delusion. Her first call was dialed to emergency services. When the dispatcher answered, they were met not with the frantic screams or hysterical crying of a mother in distress, but with a flat, emotionless voice. She spoke with a chilling clarity, requesting that police officers be sent immediately to her home because she needed them. She offered no elaborate explanations, no hysterics, and no pleas for mercy. Immediately after concluding the call with emergency services, she dialed her husband's workplace. Rusty Yates was sitting at his desk, deep into the routine of his workday, completely unaware that the fragile safety net they had constructed had utterly failed. When he answered the phone, Andrea's voice was as detached and direct as it had been with the 911 dispatcher. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply told him that he needed to drop everything and come home right away. The chilling brevity of her message carried no emotional warning of the disaster that awaited him, leaving Rusty to drive home through the bright Houston traffic with a growing sense of confusion, completely unprepared for the apocalyptic reality that was waiting behind his front door. Within a short time, the first police cruisers arrived at the Yates residence, their lights flashing silently against the bright suburban morning. The officers stepped out, expecting a routine emergency call, but they were met at the front door by Andrea herself. Her clothes were soaked through with water, heavy and clinging to her frame, yet her demeanor was utterly placid. She stood before the armed officers with a disturbing composure, offering no resistance, no attempts to run, and no defensive arguments. When the officers stepped inside the house and followed her directions, walking into the bedroom to uncover the blankets, they were confronted with a scene so profoundly horrific that it would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. The 5 children lay side by side, perfectly still, tucked beneath the covers. In that exact moment, as the realization of what had occurred settled heavily upon the responding officers, the doors were flung open to a massive, complex legal, medical, and social storm. The morning of June the 20th, 2001, became a permanent scar on the collective conscience of the community and the nation. The physical act was over, but the monumental task of understanding how a mother could be driven to such lengths by her own mind was just beginning. The arrest of Andrea Yates was swift, quiet, and devoid of struggle, but it marked the opening salvo in a fierce, multi-year battle over the exact definitions of sanity, criminal responsibility, and the terrifying power of postpartum psychosis. The house on that sunny morning was transformed from a family home into a profound crime scene, capturing the absolute apex of a tragedy that had been quietly building for years, fueled by ignored warnings, extreme ideological pressures, and the devastating, unyielding march of untreated mental illness. The physical arrest of Andrea Yates on the morning of June the 20th, 2001, marked the immediate end of the tragedy within the walls of her home, but it simultaneously opened the floodgates to a massive, complex, and emotionally charged investigation. The moment the police officers stepped into the master bedroom and uncovered the blanket to reveal the 5 motionless bodies of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, the case transformed from a local domestic emergency into a high-profile criminal investigation that would immediately capture the horrified attention of the entire nation. The initial investigative steps taken by the Houston Police Department were methodical, driven by the stark, undeniable physical evidence left at the scene and the chillingly cooperative demeanor of the suspect herself. There was no need for a manhunt, no need for forensic tracking, and no complex gathering of hidden clues, because the perpetrator was standing right at the front door, waiting in soaked clothing, ready to confess to every detail of the horrific acts she had committed. The lead investigators and homicide detectives assigned to the case entered a house that felt frozen in time, an oppressive silence hanging heavy in the air where the chaotic sounds of 5 young children should have been echoing. The primary crime scene investigation focused intensely on the master bedroom and the adjoining bathroom, the 2 locations that encapsulated the entirety of the tragedy. In the bathroom, forensic technicians documented the filled bathtub, the lingering moisture on the porcelain surfaces, and the precise environment where the lives of the children had been extinguished. In the bedroom, the chilling sight of the children laid out neatly on the bed, covered carefully with blankets, presented the investigators with a profoundly disturbing psychological puzzle. It was a crime scene completely devoid of the chaotic struggle, defensive wounds, or frenzied destruction typically associated with violent homicides. Instead, it bore the unmistakable hallmarks of a deeply methodical, highly ritualized sequence of actions executed by someone operating under a completely altered perception of reality. As the physical evidence was meticulously collected, cataloged, and analyzed by forensic experts, the investigative focus shifted rapidly toward the interrogation room and the comprehensive gathering of Andrea's medical and psychiatric history. Detectives knew that to build a credible case for the prosecutors, they had to look far beyond the physical facts of the morning and dive deep into the psychological labyrinth that had produced such an incomprehensible outcome. They began subpoenaing years of medical records, psychiatric hospital admissions charts, prescription histories, and notes from the numerous doctors who had treated Andrea over the course of her struggles with postpartum depression and psychosis. Every file pulled from hospital archives added another layer to the complex puzzle, revealing a chronic, escalating pattern of mental deterioration that had been repeatedly flagged by medical professionals but inadequately managed by the support systems surrounding her. Concurrently, investigators conducted exhaustive interviews with family members, friends, neighbors, and medical staff who had interacted with Andrea and Rusty Yates in the months and weeks leading up to the tragedy. These interviews painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a family under siege by an invisible enemy. Witnesses described a mother who had become increasingly withdrawn, weighed down by an overwhelming burden of despair, and frequently caught in the grip of terrifying hallucinations that she struggled to articulate. The interviews also brought to light the intense internal pressures Andrea faced, stemming from the collision between her severe psychiatric vulnerabilities and the rigid religious expectations that governed their household. Investigators scrutinized the timeline of her recent medication changes, tracking the exact moments when crucial antipsychotic treatments had been stopped or altered, creating the dangerous chemical imbalance that ultimately allowed her psychosis to shatter her final connections to the real world. However, the most critical phase of the investigation centered on the formal interrogation and psychological evaluation of Andrea herself. Detectives sat down across from her in the interrogation room, expecting perhaps to find a hardened criminal or a woman consumed by sudden, hysterical remorse. Instead, they encountered a fragile, detached individual who spoke in a flat, monotone voice, completely devoid of defensive posturing or emotional volatility. When questioned about the events of that morning, Andrea did not attempt to deny her actions, minimize her responsibility in a legal sense, or invent alibis. Instead, with a haunting, matter-of-fact calmness, she detailed the sequence of events step by step, explaining how she had placed each child in the water. Crucially, as she spoke, she revealed the core of her horrifying delusions to the detectives, explaining her absolute, unshakable belief that she was saving her children from eternal damnation, protecting their souls from the demonic corruption she believed she carried within her own soul. This confession presented the prosecution and the investigative team with a profound legal and ethical dilemma that would define the entire trajectory of the case. Under the strict legal framework of the state of Texas, the insanity defense is notoriously difficult to prove and demands meeting a very specific, stringent threshold. The law requires that at the exact time of the commission of the offense, the accused must suffer from a severe mental disease or defect that completely deprives them of the capacity to know that their conduct is morally wrong. The investigators and prosecutors immediately recognized that Andrea's behavior immediately following the acts, specifically her decision to call 911, her call to her husband, and her immediate confession to the police, would be weaponized by the state to argue that she clearly understood the nature and the societal wrongness of her actions. If she knew it was wrong to hide things from the law, the state would argue, she must have known that what she did was legally wrong, regardless of her internal religious or delusional justifications. As the investigative files grew thicker and the psychiatric evaluations multiplied, a fierce battle lines began to draw between the state's chosen experts and the defense attorneys who were tasked with representing a woman universally reviled by a public demanding immediate, unsparing retribution. The prosecution relied heavily on specialized medical witnesses who would argue that while Andrea was undeniably mentally ill, she still possessed enough cognitive function to realize that killing her children was against the law, pointing to her methodical preparations and her calm surrender as proof of a rational, calculating mind operating beneath the veneer of sickness. Conversely, the defense team marshaled an impressive array of prominent psychiatrists, independent mental health researchers, and medical historians who had studied the most extreme manifestations of postpartum psychosis. These experts argued passionately that Andrea's delusions were so absolute, total, and overpowering that the concept of moral right and wrong had been completely inverted in her mind, making her incapable of understanding that her actions were wrong in the profoundest sense of the word. The investigative phase thus evolved into a grueling war of attrition fought through psychiatric reports, legal briefs, and pretrial motions that tested the limits of the American judicial system's ability to handle cases where mental illness intersects with horrific violence. Every piece of evidence gathered during those weeks following June the 20th was meticulously scrutinized, weighed, and argued over by legal teams preparing for a courtroom showdown that everyone knew would be historic. The public watched with bated breath, torn between a natural, visceral desire for vengeance for the 5 innocent lives lost and a growing, uncomfortable awareness of the dark, uncharted territories of severe psychiatric disorders that society had long ignored or swept under the rug. The investigation had successfully uncovered the physical truth of what happened in that house, but it had also exposed a much larger, more terrifying systemic failure, setting the stage for a courtroom battle that would force the nation to confront the harrowing reality of a mind completely consumed by disease. The courtroom battle that commenced in the spring of 2002 transformed the Houston courthouse into a national theater where the agonizing intersection of criminal law and severe psychiatric illness was placed on trial. From the opening statements, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was heavy with tension, charged with the visceral grief of a community and a nation struggling to comprehend a crime of such staggering magnitude. The prosecution, representing the state of Texas, approached the case with a clear, uncompromising strategy designed to cut through the complex medical jargon of postpartum psychosis and focus the jury's attention entirely on the cold, deliberate mechanics of the acts themselves. They argued that regardless of Andrea Yates's documented history of mental illness, her actions on the morning of June the 20th demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt and a precise understanding of societal rules. To support this narrative, prosecutors emphasized her methodical preparation, the deliberate filling of the bathtub, the systematic targeting of her children one by one, and her subsequent efforts to call emergency services and her husband immediately after the completion of the acts. They contended that because she knew to call the police and confess, she inherently understood that her conduct was legally wrong, satisfying the strict legal definition required to secure a conviction for capital murder. Conversely, the defense team faced the daunting task of piercing through the public outrage and the rigid statutory requirements of the Texas insanity defense to expose the absolute devastation of Andrea's psychotic state. Their presentation relied heavily on the testimony of preeminent psychiatrists, medical experts, and independent mental health professionals who had spent countless hours evaluating Andrea and reviewing her extensive psychiatric history. These experts painted a harrowing, detailed portrait of a mind completely hijacked by postpartum psychosis and severe schizophrenia, explaining to the briar-eyed jurors that Andrea's internal reality had been so violently distorted that the concepts of right and wrong had completely lost their standard meanings. They explained that her delusions were not merely eccentric thoughts or passing sadness, but absolute, commanding imperatives driven by the terrifying belief that she was saving her children from eternal damnation. The defense argued passionately that at the exact moment she took her children's lives, Andrea was entirely incapable of understanding the moral wrongness of her actions because her diseased brain had inverted reality, convincing her that her horrific acts were an expression of ultimate maternal sacrifice and love. The emotional core of the trial was further complicated by the painful testimony of family members, most notably Rusty Yates, who stood in the uncomfortable position of both grieving the loss of all 5 of his children and advocating for the woman who had killed them. Rusty's testimony provided a devastating window into the domestic reality of the household leading up to the tragedy, detailing the relentless cycle of pregnancies, the escalating severity of Andrea's psychiatric collapses, and the desperate, failed attempts by the family to navigate a medical system that they felt ultimately abandoned them. His presence in the courtroom served as a poignant reminder of the complex human tragedy underlying the legal technicalities, illustrating a family caught in the crossfire of a catastrophic medical failure. However, the prosecution cross-examined witnesses relentlessly, probing into the medical decisions, the discontinuation of medications, and instances where Andrea appeared lucid or capable of basic daily tasks, using these moments to cast doubt on the totality of her incapacity during the critical hour of the crime. The trial reached its most dramatic inflection point during the expert testimonies, where a fierce battle of psychiatric credentials and interpretations unfolded before the jury. Witnesses for both sides dissected every word Andrea had spoken to police, every entry in her hospital charts, and every nuance of her behavior in the interrogation room. It was during this intense scientific and legal sparring that the systemic flaws and extreme pressures of high-profile trials were exposed. The jury was tasked with an impossibly heavy burden: to look past the visceral horror of 5 children drowned in a bathtub and evaluate whether a severely mentally ill mother was legally responsible for crimes committed entirely within the grip of a hallucination. The societal pressure weighing on the courtroom was immense, with public opinion sharply divided between a demand for absolute, unsparing retribution and a growing, uneasy awareness of the medical reality of postpartum psychosis that society had long ignored or misunderstood. After weeks of harrowing testimony, emotional arguments, and intense deliberation, the first major legal chapter of the case concluded in 2002 when the jury delivered its verdict. Rejecting the defense's argument that Andrea was legally insane at the time of the offenses, the briar-eyed jury found her guilty of capital murder. The verdict sent a shockwave through the medical and legal communities, establishing a precedent that despite severe mental illness, a defendant could still be held fully criminally culpable if they demonstrated any awareness of their actions or attempted to contact authorities afterward. Following the guilty verdict, the penalty phase of the trial commenced to determine whether Andrea would face the death penalty or spend the rest of her life in prison. In a decision that reflected the deep ambivalence and underlying recognition of her profound mental illness, the jury ultimately spared her life, sentencing Andrea Yates to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. It was a compromise verdict that satisfied neither side completely, leaving the larger questions of justice, mental health, and legal standards hanging heavily in the balance. However, the legal saga of Andrea Yates was far from over, as the initial conviction was destined to unravel under the weight of a critical procedural error discovered years later. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals ordered a new trial, overturning the original conviction due to a revelation that shocked the legal community. During the first trial, a prominent psychiatrist and expert witness for the prosecution, Dr. Park Dietz, had testified under oath that he had consulted on an episode of the television show Law and Order featuring a storyline about a mother who drowned her children in a bathtub and was subsequently found insane. Prosecution lawyers used this testimony to suggest that Andrea may have been influenced by or copied the fictional television plot. However, it was later discovered through rigorous appellate investigation that no such episode of Law and Order had ever existed prior to the murders. This critical error in expert testimony had profoundly misled the jury, contaminating the foundation upon which the original guilty verdict had been rendered and necessitating a complete do-over of the judicial proceedings. The granting of a new trial set the stage for a historic legal rematch that would take place in 2006, forcing the justice system to re-examine the entire tragedy through a more refined, scientifically informed lens. By this time, the public conversation surrounding postpartum psychosis had evolved significantly, shaped by years of intense media coverage, advocacy by mental health professionals, and a broader societal education regarding the devastating realities of psychiatric disorders associated with childbirth. The defense team entered the retrial with a renewed, highly focused strategy centered entirely on the unambiguous medical consensus regarding Andrea's mental state at the time of the murders. The evidence was presented once again, but this time, the prosecution and the defense operated within a legal environment that was far more receptive to the profound complexities of severe postpartum psychosis and the absolute impairment of moral reasoning it inflicted upon its sufferers. The climax of the legal proceedings arrived in the summer of 2006, when the second jury retired to deliberate on the fate of Andrea Yates. Unlike the first trial, this jury reached a fundamentally different conclusion, delivering a verdict that would alter the legal landscape of mental health defenses in America. The briar-eyed jurors found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. This definitive legal determination meant that the jury accepted the overwhelming medical evidence proving that at the exact moment she committed the acts, her severe mental disease had completely deprived her of the capacity to know that her conduct was morally wrong. The verdict marked a stunning legal turnaround, closing the courtroom chapter of the tragedy not with a prison sentence, but with a transition from the criminal justice system into the medical and psychiatric infrastructure that should have provided her with comprehensive, uninterrupted care years before the tragedy ever occurred. The conclusion of the legal proceedings in 2006 did not bring a sense of closure or celebration, but rather a heavy, reflective quiet that hung over everyone touched by the tragedy. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity meant that Andrea Yates would not spend her remaining years behind the harsh, unforgiving bars of a maximum security prison, but it also meant she would never walk free as a mother again. Instead of being processed through the penal system, her pathway shifted entirely from criminal punishment to indefinite psychiatric confinement and medical supervision. She was immediately transferred from county custody to a high-security state mental health facility, specifically the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, where she would begin the rest of her life under round-the-clock observation, professional psychiatric treatment, and secure containment. The physical transition from a prison cell to a psychiatric ward symbolized a profound, albeit agonizingly delayed, recognition by the legal system that criminal culpability cannot fairly be assigned to a mind that was entirely broken by severe, unmanaged disease. Within the sterile, secure walls of the hospital, Andrea was forced to live with the stark, unchanging reality of what she had done, stripped of her delusions by antipsychotic medications, finally able to comprehend the horrifying magnitude of the loss she had inflicted upon her family and herself. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the walls of the hospital room and the courtroom, sparking a global conversation that fundamentally transformed how society, medicine, and the legal system approach the dark and often hidden world of maternal mental health. For decades, postpartum depression and its severe, psychotic extremes had been largely shrouded in social stigma, dismissed by the general public and sometimes even by medical professionals as mere moodiness, adjustment difficulties, or the ordinary stress of coping with a large family. The case of Andrea Yates ripped away those comforting illusions, dragging a terrifying reality into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Mental health advocates, researchers, and physicians mobilized around her case, using the immense national attention to demand sweeping reforms in prenatal and postnatal care. They argued passionately that screening for postpartum psychiatric distress should be as routine and mandatory as checking a newborn's vital signs, and that doctors must take immediate, aggressive action when a mother shows the first signs of detachment from reality. The tragedy became a powerful, albeit heartbreaking, catalyst for awareness, forcing medical institutions to update their protocols, educate practitioners more rigorously, and treat postpartum psychosis, not as a psychological weakness, but as a critical, life-threatening medical emergency requiring immediate, specialized intervention. In the years that followed her institutionalization, the name Andrea Yates remained a haunting touchstone in discussions regarding the insanity defense and the complex relationship between law and psychiatry. Legal scholars and ethicists dissected the verdict for decades, using the case as a primary textbook example of how the American judicial system attempts to navigate the impossible boundary line where severe mental illness completely overwrites human agency and moral comprehension. The case exposed the deep flaws inherent in rigid legal definitions of sanity, demonstrating how difficult it is for juries to separate the visceral horror of a crime from the cold, clinical reality of a psychotic brain. It prompted ongoing debates about the adequacy of psychiatric care within the criminal justice system and highlighted the desperate need for specialized courts or alternative judicial frameworks that can handle defendants suffering from severe mental impairments without relying solely on traditional punitive measures. The legacy of her trial continues to shape how defense attorneys build insanity arguments and how medical experts testify in cases where mental illness intersects with devastating violence, serving as both a warning about the catastrophic cost of systemic failures and a milestone in the legal recognition of severe psychiatric disorders. For Rusty Yates, The aftermath of the trial and the years following the tragedy required an unimaginably difficult journey of survival, grief, and emotional reconstruction. Losing all 5 of his children in a single morning, followed by the public exposure and legal trials of his wife, created a vacuum of loss that defies easy description. Over the years, Rusty chose a path of public advocacy rather than bitter isolation, dedicating portions of his life to educating the public about the severe dangers of untreated postpartum mental illness. He spoke openly about his family's experiences, acknowledging the warning signs that were missed, the medical missteps that occurred, and the profound tragedy of a system that failed to protect both his children and his wife from the devastating progression of her disease. His public stance challenged simplistic narratives of pure evil, forcing audiences to confront the uncomfortable nuance that mental illness can completely destroy a family from the inside out without any malice or hatred existing in the hearts of those involved. His willingness to share his pain became an essential component of the broader societal education that emerged from the ruins of the Yates household, bridging the gap between clinical statistics and the raw, human face of tragedy. As the years marched onward, life inside the Kerrville State Hospital settled into a quiet, unchanging routine for Andrea. Reports from medical professionals and legal representatives over the subsequent decades indicated that once her mind was cleared of the suffocating fog of untreated schizophrenia and psychosis by consistent medication, she experienced periods of profound, agonizing clarity. She understood fully what had happened on that June morning, carrying the immense, crushing weight of her actions without the protective shield of her delusions. Despite being legally eligible to periodically request hearings for release or transfer to a less restrictive facility, Andrea consistently chose not to pursue freedom. Those close to the situation noted that she preferred to remain within the secure, structured environment of the hospital, recognizing both her ongoing need for medical management and the heavy, inescapable penance she owed to the memory of her children. Her daily existence became defined by quiet reflection, art therapy, and a solitary existence governed by the medical regimen that kept her anchored to the real world she had once so violently lost touch with. The story of the Yates family stands as a permanent, sobering reminder of the fragile architecture of the human mind and the critical importance of a compassionate, vigilant societal safety net. It is a narrative that resists easy categorization, forcing anyone who examines it to stare unflinchingly into the dark spaces where medicine, law, and human suffering collide. The 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, remain the central, heartbreaking victims of a catastrophe that could have been prevented had the warning signs been heeded, the medications maintained, and the medical consensus prioritized over ideological resistance. Their short lives, though ended in unimaginable sorrow, fundamentally altered the cultural landscape of maternal mental health, ensuring that future generations of mothers struggling in the dark would find more awareness, better medical protocols, and a society far more willing to listen before it is too late. The silence that fell over the house on that summer morning in 2001 may never truly be filled, but the echoes of the tragedy continue to reverberate, demanding vigilance, empathy, and an unyielding commitment to understanding the true depths of psychiatric illness. The passage of time does little to soften the stark edges of a tragedy as profound as the one that unfolded in the Yates household, leaving behind a permanent imprint on the collective conscience of society and the medical community alike. Decades have passed since that fateful morning in June, yet the questions raised by the case continue to echo through legal seminars, psychiatric lecture halls, and the quiet grief of those who remember the 5 children whose lives were cut so short. The narrative of Andrea Yates has long since ceased to be merely a high-profile criminal news story. It has evolved into a profound historical touchstone representing the catastrophic human cost of untreated mental illness, the fierce collisions between religious dogma and empirical medicine, and the agonizing limitations of a legal system attempting to quantify human sanity. As the years have accumulated, the world outside has changed dramatically, technology has advanced, and generations have shifted, but inside the structured confines of her institutional home, time moves differently, anchored entirely by the weight of memory, medication, and an unyielding penance, Within the walls of the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, Andrea Yates has spent the modern era living a life of absolute quietude and routine. Freed from the suffocating, terrifying hallucinations of postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia by steady, managed doses of antipsychotic medication, her days are far removed from the turbulent external world. Legal representatives and medical staff who have interacted with her over the years have consistently noted that she lives with a quiet, profound awareness of the past, carrying the heavy burden of her actions without the protective barrier of the delusions that once dictated her reality. Although she remains legally entitled under state guidelines to request annual reviews and hearings to evaluate her fitness for potential release or transfer to a less restrictive environment, she has steadfastly chosen to waive those hearings year after year. Choosing to remain institutionalized, she occupies her time with simple, repetitive tasks, creating crafts such as greeting cards and aprons that are often sold anonymously, living a life stripped of any public visibility. For Andrea, the hospital is not merely a place of containment, but a necessary sanctuary where she continues to manage a fragile brain chemistry while silently grieving the children she lost. The broader cultural and medical landscape has undergone a remarkable transformation in direct response to the horrors of this case, ensuring that the suffering of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary was not entirely in vain. In the years following her final trial, medical institutions across the United States and around the globe instituted sweeping reforms regarding the screening, diagnosis, and treatment of perinatal and postpartum mood disorders. What was once routinely dismissed as standard maternal fatigue or postpartum blues is now recognized by modern obstetrics and psychiatry as a critical window of vulnerability requiring aggressive, proactive intervention. Healthcare providers are now extensively trained to look beyond polite surface answers from new mothers, screening systematically for intrusive thoughts, severe anxiety, and early signs of detachment from reality. Public awareness campaigns have dismantled much of the deep-seated stigma that historically forced struggling mothers to hide their psychological pain in shame and isolation, encouraging open dialogue between families, obstetricians, and mental health specialists. The tragedy served as a brutal wake-up call, fundamentally rewriting medical protocols and establishing a standard of care designed to catch vulnerable patients before they slip over the edge into the abyss of psychosis. In the legal sphere, the case remains a foundational textbook study in law schools across the country, frequently examined whenever discussions turn to the complexities of the insanity defense and the criminal culpability of the severely mentally impaired. Legal scholars continue to debate the narrow, rigid statutory definitions that forced two separate juries to grapple with contrasting interpretations of moral awareness versus delusional compulsion. The initial wrongful conviction, subsequently overturned due to false expert testimony, exposed the dangerous vulnerabilities that can infect high-profile trials when public outrage and systemic pressure override scientific objectivity. Consequently, modern jurisprudence and forensic psychiatry approach cases involving postpartum psychosis with a heightened awareness of how entirely a disease can dismantle a person's cognitive framework, shifting the judicial focus toward more rigorous, transparent medical evaluations. The legal legacy of Andrea Yates stands as a permanent reminder that the law must possess the capacity to differentiate between malicious criminal intent and the devastating collapse of a human mind driven by organic illness. Outside the medical and legal institutions, the human dimension of the tragedy persists through the quiet, enduring resilience of Rusty Yates, who chose a path of public education rather than bitter isolation. Over the decades, he has spoken candidly about the warning signs that were tragically missed, the dangerous friction between medical advice and ideological beliefs, and the desperate need for a more comprehensive societal safety net to protect families from similar catastrophes. His willingness to share the intimate details of his family's descent into darkness has humanized the clinical statistics, reminding the public that behind every major true crime case are real human beings who loved deeply, suffered immensely, and navigated an impossible labyrinth of pain. By maintaining a compassionate, forgiving perspective toward his ex-wife and dedicating portions of his life to mental health advocacy, Rusty helped shift the public narrative away from simple demonization and toward a deeper, more empathetic understanding of how psychiatric illness destroys lives from within. Ultimately, the story of the Yates family settles into history as an enduring testament to the fragile architecture of the human mind and the high stakes of societal indifference. The 5 young children, Noah, who tried to run, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, remain frozen in time as innocent symbols of a system that failed to protect them when they needed it most. Their brief existence and tragic departure permanently altered the way the world perceives maternal mental health, ensuring that future generations of mothers struggling in silence will find greater empathy, better medical vigilance, and a society far more willing to listen before tragedy strikes. The silence that settled over the Houston home on that summer morning will never truly be broken by the laughter of those children, but the echoes of their story continue to demand vigilance, compassion, and an unyielding commitment to understanding the true depths of psychiatric disease. The final chapter of this profound tragedy does not belong to the courtroom dramas, the medical journals, or the public debates that raged across the nation, but rather to the enduring silence that fills the spaces where vibrant young lives once flourished. As time continues its relentless march forward, the memory of that fateful June morning remains etched into the cultural landscape of Houston and the collective consciousness of a society forever changed by the events. The house on Beachcomber Lane, where the unimaginable took place, stands today as a haunting symbol of a domestic sanctuary completely overtaken by an invisible, destructive force. Although new residents have eventually occupied the physical space, attempting to write their own normal chapters in a home burdened by history, the echoes of the past linger just beneath the surface, reminding anyone who knows the story of how quickly the ordinary rhythms of family life can be shattered when severe mental illness goes unmanaged and misunderstood. The physical structure of the home was forever altered by the tragedy, but its true significance lies in its status as an eternal monument to the high cost of societal and medical failure. The 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, continue to live on in memory not merely as victims of a horrific crime, but as individual lights whose bright, unique potentials were snuffed out entirely too soon. Those who knew them, from neighbors to extended family members, remember Noah as a bright, protective older brother who tried his best to understand a world that was growing increasingly confusing around him, John as an energetic, curious boy filled with infectious laughter, Paul and Luke as a bonded pair of toddlers whose days were filled with simple games and joyful exploration, and baby Mary as a fragile, innocent infant who barely had time to experience the warmth of the world before her. Life was extinguished. Their names, recited in classrooms, medical seminars, and legal arguments over the decades, represent the human face behind the clinical statistics of postpartum psychosis. They are the true anchors of this narrative, reminding every person who studies the case that the ultimate tragedy was not just the legal battle or the societal debate, but the absolute loss of 5 innocent futures that deserve to be lived. In the sphere of professional psychiatry and maternal health care, the ongoing legacy of the case serves as a permanent, cautionary guidepost for how modern medicine approaches the delicate transition of childbirth. Medical schools and residency programs routinely incorporate the tragedy of Andrea Yates into their curricula, using her comprehensive history to teach young doctors about the insidious, rapid progression of postpartum psychosis and the vital importance of listening to the desperate warnings of struggling mothers. The mistakes made in her treatment, the abrupt cessation of crucial medications, the failure to heed psychiatric warnings against subsequent pregnancies, and the gaps in the familial support network are meticulously analyzed to ensure that modern practitioners do not repeat the fatal oversights of the past. Today, obstetrical units across hospitals are increasingly equipped with integrated mental health screenings, ensuring that postpartum depression is no longer treated as a private emotional failing to be hidden away, but as a severe medical emergency demanding immediate, comprehensive intervention. The lessons forged in the fires of this tragedy have undoubtedly saved countless lives by giving doctors the tools and the awareness to catch other mothers before they reach the terrifying precipice of total psychological collapse. The legal and ethical dimensions of the case also continue to shape the evolution of jurisprudence regarding mental illness and criminal responsibility. Courts across the nation look back at the landmark retrial of 2006 as a pivotal moment when the American legal system was forced to reconcile the rigid boundaries of statutory definitions with the complex, undeniable realities of severe psychiatric impairment. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity established a critical precedent, affirming that when a disease completely overwrites a person's cognitive framework and destroys their capacity to understand moral right from wrong, the appropriate response of society is not punitive incarceration, but secure, indefinite medical containment and treatment. Legal scholars continue to debate the balance between public safety and psychiatric rehabilitation, using the Yates case as the ultimate benchmark for measuring how well or how poorly the justice system handles defendants who commit horrific acts while entirely trapped within the throes of a psychotic break. The debates sparked by her trials have fostered a more nuanced, scientifically grounded approach to forensic psychology, ensuring that future defendants suffering from organic brain diseases receive evaluations that honor the medical truth rather than yielding entirely to the emotional demands of public outrage. For Rusty Yates, the decades following the tragedy have been defined by an extraordinary journey of personal endurance, advocacy, and quiet reflection. Choosing to confront his immense grief publicly rather than retreating into bitterness, he transformed his personal nightmare into a platform for education and reform. By speaking out consistently about the dangers of untreated postpartum mental illness, the critical need for robust family support systems, and the importance of open communication regarding psychological distress, he helped humanize a tragedy that many preferred to view in black and white terms of absolute evil. His willingness to forgive, his continued compassion for Andrea despite everything that occurred, and his dedication to ensuring that other families do not suffer a similar fate have left an indelible mark on the mental health advocacy community. His life stands as a testament to the fact that healing, while never complete, is possible even after experiencing the most profound and catastrophic loss imaginable, providing a guiding light for others navigating the darkest corners of grief and trauma. Inside the secure walls of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates herself continues to inhabit a world defined by absolute quiet, rigid routine, and the heavy, inescapable shadow of her actions. Now an older woman whose life has been entirely shaped by decades of institutional supervision and steady pharmacological management, she lives a remarkably unobtrusive existence. Medical professionals and legal advocates who cross her path note that she remains cooperative, reflective, and deeply cognizant of the history that brought her there. By consistently choosing to waive her rights to annual release hearings, she demonstrates a profound, ongoing acceptance of her medical reality and the penance she owes to the memory of her children. Her days are spent quietly, far away from the glaring lights of media attention and public scrutiny, anchored entirely by the medical regimen that keeps her tethered to the real world. She is a living embodiment of the tragic intersection between human vulnerability and severe psychiatric disease, a person whose mind was completely stolen by an illness that society failed to recognize and treat in time. Ultimately, the story of Andrea Yates and her 5 children settles into the permanent annals of history as a sobering, unforgettable lesson in empathy, vigilance, and the absolute fragility of the human mind. It demands that we look beyond the superficial comforts of our daily routines and confront the uncomfortable, hidden truths of severe psychological suffering that can fester silently within any community. The tragedy challenges us to build a world where mothers struggling in the dark are met not with stigma, isolation, or judgment, but with immediate, compassionate medical care and an unwavering societal safety net. The 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, will never grow up to fulfill their dreams, but their enduring legacy lives on in every life saved by improved postpartum protocols, in every legal ruling that respects the medical reality of mental illness, and in every conversation that dares to break the silence surrounding maternal mental health. The shadows cast on that summer morning in 2001 are long and deep, but they are matched by a renewed, collective commitment to ensuring that such a devastating convergence of failures is never allowed to happen again. The final reflection upon this harrowing journey brings us to the ultimate realization that the story of the Yates family is not merely a chronicle of destruction, but a profound test of humanity's capacity for empathy, understanding, and institutional evolution. When we trace the path from the bright, ordinary suburban morning of June the 20th, 2001, through the grueling legal battles, the medical revelations, and the quiet decades of institutional containment, we are forced to confront the darkest corners of the human condition. The tragedy exposed the catastrophic vulnerabilities that emerge when severe mental illness collides with rigid social expectations, medical miscommunication, and the profound isolation that so often plagues mothers struggling behind closed doors. It is a narrative that resists the comfort of simple categorization, refusing to allow us the easy luxury of dismissing the events as the product of pure, unadulterated evil. Instead, it demands that we look deeper, acknowledging the terrifying, transformative power of postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia, diseases that can utterly rewrite a person's reality, invert their deepest instincts, and drive them to perform actions that defy every law of nature and morality. The legacy of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary remains eternally intertwined with the evolution of how modern society perceives, diagnoses, and treats maternal mental health. Their untimely and heartbreaking deaths served as a violent catalyst that forced the medical community to strip away decades of stigma and willful blindness regarding the severity of postpartum psychiatric disorders. Before that fateful morning, society largely romanticized motherhood as a state of innate, unyielding bliss, conveniently ignoring the biological and psychological precipices that new mothers frequently walk along. The shockwaves of the Yates case shattered those illusions forever, prompting a systemic overhaul of prenatal and postnatal care guidelines across the medical spectrum. Today, healthcare professionals are trained to recognize that postpartum depression and psychosis are medical emergencies of the highest order, requiring immediate, aggressive intervention rather than passive observation or moral judgment. The lives of the 5 children, though tragically extinguished, became the anchor for a global movement toward better education, routine psychological screenings, and comprehensive support systems designed to ensure that no mother ever again has to suffer in absolute isolation while her mind fractures under the weight of untreated disease. In the legal and ethical arenas, the case continues to stand as an enduring benchmark for discussions surrounding the insanity defense and the complex intersection of criminal culpability and organic brain pathology. The tumultuous path from the initial guilty verdict in 2002 to the historic acquittal by reason of insanity in 2006 demonstrated the agonizing difficulty of applying rigid statutory definitions to a mind completely consumed by delusions. It exposed the dangers of prosecutorial overreach and the critical necessity of maintaining absolute scientific objectivity and truth within the courtroom. The legal battles forced the American judicial system to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that punishment loses its moral foundation when applied to individuals who possess no cognitive capacity to understand the wrongness of their actions due to severe mental defect. By ultimately recognizing Andrea Yates as not guilty by reason of insanity, the legal system established a vital precedent affirming that true justice sometimes requires treatment and containment rather than incarceration, acknowledging that a broken brain is as worthy of medical intervention as any physical trauma. The personal journey of Rusty Yates over the intervening decades provides a poignant counterpoint to the horror of the crime, illustrating the immense capacity of the human spirit to endure, reflect, and seek redemption through advocacy. Rather than retreating into permanent bitterness or hiding from the public eye, he chose to step forward into the uncomfortable light of public scrutiny to share his family's painful lessons with the world. His tireless efforts to educate the public about the warning signs of postpartum psychosis, the dangers of ignoring medical advice, and the vital importance of robust family support networks have played an essential role in transforming how society views similar tragedies. By maintaining a posture of forgiveness and understanding toward the woman who took his children, Rusty challenged the public to embrace nuance and empathy over vengeance and hatred. His life stands as a testament to the fact that while grief of that magnitude can never truly be healed, it can be channeled into a powerful force for good, ensuring that the mistakes made within his household serve as a warning and a guide for others navigating the dark waters of severe psychological distress. Within the secure boundaries of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates continues to live out her days in a state of quiet, reflective penance, anchored by the consistent medical management that keeps her connected to reality. The decades of institutionalization have stripped away the terrifying delusions that dictated her actions on that summer morning, leaving her with a clear, agonizing awareness of what was lost. Her consistent choice to waive her rights to annual release hearings underscores a profound, deeply personal acceptance of her ongoing need for medical supervision and her quiet recognition of the heavy debt she owes to the memory of her children. She exists now not as a public spectacle, but as a somber human reminder of the devastating toll that untreated mental illness can exact when the societal safety net fails to catch a falling soul. Her existence behind hospital walls is a quiet, unbroken vigil, a stark contrast to the media frenzy that once surrounded her name, defined entirely by routine, art therapy, and the heavy shadow of a past that can never be undone. The house on Beachcomber Lane, along with the memories of the 5 bright children who once filled its rooms with laughter and chaos, remains a permanent historical landmark in the ongoing narrative of mental health awareness. Although the physical spaces have changed and new families have walked through those doors, the profound lessons embedded in the history of the house continue to resonate across generations. The tragedy challenges every one of us to remain vigilant, to look beyond the polite facades of those around us, and to foster environments of radical empathy and open communication where mental health struggles can be shared without fear of judgment or stigma. We are reminded that safety is a fragile construct and that the ultimate defense against such unimaginable horrors is a compassionate, scientifically informed society that refuses to look away from suffering. As we draw this comprehensive exploration to a close, the echoes of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary still linger in the quiet spaces of our collective memory. Their brief, beautiful lives were cut short by a catastrophic failure of medical intervention, systemic support, and societal awareness, but their enduring legacy has forever changed the world for the better. Every mother who receives timely psychiatric care, every medical professional who recognizes the subtle signs of postpartum distress, every legal ruling that respects the medical reality of insanity, and every conversation that breaks the silence surrounding maternal mental health is a direct result of the painful lessons learned from the Yates tragedy. The shadows cast on that June morning in 2001 were deep and dark, but they have ultimately illuminated a path toward greater compassion, deeper understanding, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us from the devastating, silent storms of the human mind. As we arrive at this final and definitive reflection upon the tragic history of the Yates family, we are invited to stand at the profound intersection where human vulnerability meets the unforgiving reality of psychiatric disease. The journey through this extensive narrative has taken us from the bright, deceptively peaceful suburban morning of June the 20th, 2001, deep into the labyrinthine complexities of postpartum psychosis, severe schizophrenia, and the agonizing failures of systemic support. We have examined the meticulous, heartbreaking execution of a delusion that tore apart 5 innocent young lives, traversed the tense and fiercely contested battlegrounds of a historic courtroom trial, and witnessed the slow, reflective decades of institutional containment and public awakening that followed. Through every chapter, we have been forced to confront the absolute fragility of the human mind when it is abandoned by the medical safety nets designed to protect it, stripped of its rational tethers, and left entirely at the mercy of an internal storm that brooks no mercy and offers no escape. The enduring weight of this tragedy rests forever upon the names and memories of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. These 5 children were not merely casualties in a distant legal battle or statistics in a medical journal. They were vibrant, living souls filled with unique potential, boundless curiosity, and an absolute, unconditional trust in the mother who cared for them. Their short lives were cut down in the prime of their innocence by a devastating medical emergency that distorted maternal love into a horrifying, sacrificial delusion. The injustice of their departure lies not only in the finality of the act itself, but in the agonizing knowledge that their deaths were entirely preventable. Had the medical warnings been prioritized, had the pharmaceutical regimen been maintained with rigorous oversight, and had the societal stigma surrounding postpartum psychiatric illness been dismantled before it was too late, those children would have grown up to experience the fullness of the world they were so abruptly torn away from. Their absence remains an unfillable void, a permanent reminder of the catastrophic cost of collective ignorance and institutional oversight. The broader cultural and medical transformation catalyzed by this case stands as perhaps the only redeeming legacy born from such unimaginable sorrow. The horror of the Yates household shattered forever the comfortable, romanticized illusions that society had long maintained regarding motherhood and postpartum mental health. By dragging the dark, terrifying realities of postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia out of the shadows and into the glaring light of public scrutiny, the tragedy forced the global medical community to completely overhaul its approach to perinatal and postnatal care. Healthcare systems were compelled to recognize that severe psychiatric conditions following childbirth are medical emergencies requiring immediate, aggressive intervention rather than passive observation or moral judgment. Today, obstetrical protocols mandate comprehensive mental health screenings, educating practitioners to listen closely for the subtle, terrifying signs of intrusive thoughts and cognitive detachment before a vulnerable mother reaches the precipice of total psychological collapse. The lives of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary live on in every mother who receives timely, compassionate psychiatric care, and in every medical breakthrough that protects a fragile mind from descending into the abyss. In the realm of law and jurisprudence, the case remains an immortal cornerstone for discussions surrounding the insanity defense and the complex moral boundaries of criminal culpability. The agonizing path from the initial, flawed conviction in 2002 to the historic, scientifically grounded acquittal by reason of insanity in 2004 showcased the immense difficulty of applying rigid statutory definitions to a mind completely consumed by organic disease. It exposed the profound dangers of prosecutorial overreach and the critical necessity of maintaining absolute truth and objectivity within the courtroom, ensuring that public outrage is never allowed to override scientific reality. By ultimately establishing that a person whose cognitive framework has been utterly destroyed by severe mental defect cannot be held morally or criminally responsible for their actions, the legal system reaffirmed a fundamental tenet of justice, that true fairness requires treatment and secure containment for the sick, rather than blind, punitive incarceration. The legal precedent set by Andrea Yates's trial continues to guide forensic psychiatrists and defense attorneys worldwide, ensuring that future defendants suffering from organic brain disorders receive evaluations that respect the medical truth. The personal journey of Rusty Yates over the many decades since that fateful morning offers an extraordinary testament to the human capacity for endurance, reflection, and redemption through advocacy. Rather than retreating into permanent bitterness, isolating himself from the world, or nursing an unyielding resentment, he chose a path of public transparency and education. By stepping forward to share the intimate, painful details of his family's descent into darkness, he humanized the clinical statistics and challenged the public to embrace nuance and empathy over simple demonization. His tireless efforts to advocate for better mental health awareness, robust family support networks, and open communication regarding psychological distress have transformed his personal nightmare into a powerful force for societal good. His steadfast compassion and forgiveness toward the woman who took his children demonstrated a profound grace, reminding all who followed the case that healing, while never complete or linear, is possible even after experiencing the most profound and catastrophic loss imaginable. Inside the secure, quiet boundaries of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates lives out her remaining years in a state of solemn penance and steady medical management. The decades of institutionalization have stripped away the terrifying, distorted hallucinations that commanded her actions on that summer morning, leaving her with a clear, agonizing awareness of what was lost. Her consistent, unyielding choice to waive her rights to annual release hearings underscores a profound, deeply personal acceptance of her ongoing need for medical supervision and her quiet recognition of the heavy debt she owes to the memory of her children. She exists now not as a media spectacle, but as a somber human embodiment of the devastating toll that untreated mental illness can exact when the societal safety net fails. Her existence behind hospital walls is an unbroken vigil of quiet reflection, art therapy, and routine, anchored entirely by the pharmacological regimen that keeps her tethered to the real world she once lost touch with. The house on Beachcomber Lane, along with the eternal memories of the 5 bright children who once filled its rooms with laughter, stands as a permanent historical landmark in the ongoing narrative of mental health awareness. Although the physical spaces have eventually welcomed new lives and new chapters, the profound lessons embedded in the history of the house continue to resonate across generations, reminding us of the absolute fragility of the human mind. The tragedy challenges every one of us to remain vigilant, to look beyond the polite facades of those around us, and to foster environments of radical empathy and open communication where mental health struggles can be shared without fear of judgment, shame, or stigma. We are reminded that safety is a delicate construct and that the ultimate defense against such unimaginable horrors is a compassionate, scientifically informed society that refuses to look away from suffering, no matter how dark or uncomfortable the truth may be. As we bring this comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of the Yates family tragedy to its final close, the echoes of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary still linger softly in the quiet spaces of our collective memory. Their brief, beautiful lives were cut short by a catastrophic convergence of medical failures, systemic oversights, and societal ignorance, but their enduring legacy has forever changed the world for the better. Every mother who finds the courage to seek help in the dark, every medical professional who recognizes the subtle signs of postpartum distress, every legal ruling that respects the medical reality of insanity, and every conversation that breaks the silence surrounding maternal mental health is a direct result of the painful lessons learned from this profound tragedy. The shadows cast on that June morning in 2001 were deep and dark, but they have ultimately illuminated a path toward greater compassion, deeper understanding, and an unwavering, lifelong commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us from the devastating, silent storms of the human mind. As we step forward into this 11th and final movement of our comprehensive exploration, we are invited to synthesize the immense emotional weight, the clinical complexities, and the historical reverberations of the Yates family tragedy into a singular, overarching truth about the human condition. The long and agonizing journey through the events of June the 20th, 2001, has tested the limits of our capacity for empathy, forced us to reevaluate the strict definitions of justice, and challenged us to look unflinchingly into the darkest abysses of the unmanaged human mind. We have traced the narrative from the deceptive peace of a suburban morning through the meticulous execution of a horrific delusion, navigated the intense battlegrounds of 2 historic courtroom trials, and witnessed the slow, reflective decades of institutional containment and global medical reform. Throughout this extensive examination, one undeniable reality has remained constant. The tragedy of Andrea Yates is not merely an isolated domestic horror story, but a profound, permanent mirror reflecting the systemic failures, the medical oversights, and the cultural blind spots of a society that is only beginning to truly understand the devastating power of severe psychiatric disease. The central figures of this narrative, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, remain forever enshrined as the innocent symbols of a world that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. Their short, vibrant lives were extinguished not by malice or hatred, but by the terrifying momentum of an untreated medical emergency that entirely distorted a mother's reality. As time marches forward, the collective memory of these 5 children serves as an eternal reminder that the consequences of ignoring mental health are absolute and irreversible. Their names, spoken across medical lecture halls, legal seminars, and public advocacy forums, represent the human face behind abstract clinical statistics, ensuring that their brief existences continue to serve a vital purpose in protecting future generations. The void they left behind in the world can never truly be filled, but the legacy of their protection lives on in every mother who is safely guided through the dark storms of postpartum psychosis. In the fields of psychiatry and obstetrics, the lessons forged in the wake of this tragedy have permanently altered the standard of care, ensuring that healthcare providers remain eternally vigilant against the insidious onset of postpartum psychiatric disorders. The medical community's ongoing commitment to comprehensive screening, immediate pharmacological intervention, and the destigmatization of maternal mental health distress stands as a direct response to the fatal oversights of the past. Today, medical professionals are equipped with the knowledge and the protocols necessary to recognize that postpartum depression and psychosis are medical emergencies demanding immediate, aggressive treatment rather than passive observation or moral judgment. This systemic evolution represents a vital triumph born from unimaginable sorrow, ensuring that countless families are spared the devastating fate that befell the Yates household. In the realm of law and jurisprudence, the historic legal battles surrounding Andrea Yates have left an indelible mark on how the American judicial system handles defendants suffering from severe organic brain disorders. The landmark verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity established a critical, enduring precedent affirming that true justice requires treatment and secure containment for the sick rather than blind punitive incarceration when a disease completely destroys a person's cognitive capacity to understand moral right from wrong. Legal scholars and forensic psychiatrists continue to study the case as the ultimate benchmark for balancing public safety with clinical reality, ensuring that future trials remain anchored in scientific truth rather than yielding entirely to the emotional demands of public outrage and vengeance. The personal journey of Rusty Yates over the many years since that fateful morning continues to inspire a profound sense of respect and understanding. By choosing a path of public transparency, education, and advocacy rather than retreating into permanent bitterness or isolation, he transformed his personal nightmare into a powerful catalyst for societal good. His tireless efforts to share the intimate lessons of his family's descent into darkness, combined with his unwavering compassion and forgiveness, have challenged the public to embrace nuance and empathy over simple demonization. His life stands as a testament to the fact that while grief of that magnitude can never truly be healed, it can be channeled into an unyielding commitment to helping others navigate the darkest corners of psychological distress. Inside the secure, quiet boundaries of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates continues to inhabit a world defined by absolute quiet, rigid routine, and the heavy, inescapable shadow of her actions. Her decades of institutionalization, supported by consistent medical management and characterized by her continuous choice to waive annual release hearings, reflect a profound, personal acceptance of her ongoing need for supervision and her quiet recognition of the debt she owes to the memory of her children. She exists now not as a media spectacle, but as a somber human embodiment of the devastating toll that untreated mental illness can exact when the societal safety net fails to catch a falling soul. Her existence behind hospital walls remains an unbroken vigil of quiet reflection, anchored entirely by the pharmacological regimen that keeps her tethered to the real world she once lost touch with. The house on Beachcomber Lane, along with the eternal memories of the 5 bright children who once filled its rooms with laughter, stands as a permanent historical landmark in the ongoing narrative of mental health awareness. Although the physical spaces have eventually welcomed new lives and new chapters, the profound lessons embedded in the history of the house continue to resonate across generations, reminding us of the absolute fragility of the human mind. The tragedy challenges every one of us to remain vigilant, to look beyond the polite facades of those around us, and to foster environments of radical empathy and open communication where mental health struggles can be shared without fear of judgment, shame, or stigma. We are reminded that safety is a delicate construct, and that the ultimate defense against such unimaginable horrors is a compassionate, scientifically informed society that refuses to look away from suffering, no matter how dark or uncomfortable the truth may be. As we bring this comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of the Yates family tragedy to its final and definitive close, the echoes of Noah, John, Paul, Luke and baby Mary still linger softly in the quiet spaces of our collective memory. Their brief, beautiful lives were cut short by a catastrophic convergence of medical failures, systemic oversights, and societal ignorance, but their enduring legacy has forever changed the world for the better. Every mother who finds the courage to seek help in the dark, every medical professional who recognizes the subtle signs of postpartum distress, every legal ruling that respects the medical reality of insanity, and every conversation that breaks the silence surrounding maternal mental health is a direct result of the painful lessons learned from this profound tragedy. The shadows cast on that June morning in 2001 were deep and dark, but they have ultimately illuminated a path toward greater compassion, deeper understanding, and an unwavering, lifelong commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us from the devastating, silent storms of the human mind.